Hello, and welcome to today's conversation. How is the infrastructure rollout going? And what does it mean for tech? I'm Bennett Richardson, president of Protocol. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our partners at Intel IoT for making today's event possible. At Protocol, we aim to arm you as decision makers in technology, business, and policy with actionable news and analysis to help you do your job. It's been almost 6 months since Congress passed the landmark $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. A long way to build promised significant investments in the tech industry, including $65 billion to support broadband expansion and another $7.5 billion to promote electric vehicle adoption. What progress towards those goals have we seen so far? And what can we expect in the next few months? With sometimes bad data to go on, like inaccurate broadband maps, how should the government distribute their funding? Which tech companies are going to benefit most from this 5-year push for EV growth? Who's getting left out? In this event, we'll explore how the infrastructure bill rollout is going and what it means for you and your company. We're so glad you could tune in today. If you're not already subscribed, don't forget to sign up for Protocol Policy and Protocol's family of newsletters at protocol.com/newsletters. To kick things off, I'm excited to welcome back Samir Sharma for an executive conversation on what the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act means for the future of broadband and transportation. Samir is a global GM for new IoT markets, smart cities, and intelligent transportation at Intel. Samir leads a global team that focuses on development of smart cities around the world, establishing leadership across the industry and deploying solutions. Welcome, Samir. Great to have you back on our virtual stage.
Thank you, Bennett, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Would love your help setting the stage for the conversation today. How will the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act impact the development of smart cities in the future?
Great question, Bennett. So if you think about smart cities and the top set of use cases globally and certainly here in the US, it's always been about ensuring better public safety, better mobility for everyone with a focus on inclusion, as well as sustainability. And now if you look at those three big buckets of use cases and you look at where the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is going to actually put down the dollars, about half of it is focused on transportation in general. Everything from repairing our bridges to better public transit to ensuring better traffic flow in our cities. The other half is focused on broadband initiative, as you pointed out, with a big focus on including people who haven't had access to broadband or connectivity in the past. And the other quarter roughly goes towards smart grid modernization. So if you can see these focus areas, they map nicely into the three buckets that I've described that have been the focus for smart cities use cases. The two things that I believe we are adding are a focus on inclusion. I think we've done similar infrastructure investments in the past decades, but I think this time the focus on inclusion clearly comes through, whether if you hear how President Biden talks about it, or you hear Pete Buttigieg and his focus on ensuring that this investment happens in an equitable manner in our cities. The final thing I want to say is this infrastructure investment is going to be as much about bits and bytes and transistors, in other words, technology, as it is going to be about cement and steel. And that's a big change in mindset from, as I said, the previous rounds of investments that we have done. Now, to make it all happen, you need a village to create a smart city. And I think our panel today reflects perfectly the composition of that village that needs to come together. Everything from technology to policy making to focus on inclusion, and then finally funding and business models.
No, great point. And I want to pick up on one thing that you said there about this transition from the cement and steel infrastructure into this more digital infrastructure. Obviously, we're not just investing in today's infrastructure, but infrastructure for the future. Intel, you have a really unique view into this, because obviously Intel's critical role in powering Internet of Things from 5G to edge computing. I want to talk about future proofing. In your perspective, what's the most important investment the US can make to future proof our national infrastructure?
Bennett, as you correctly pointed out, we are coming at this more from, hey, here are the technology, I call them superpowers, that we are focused on, from 5G for connectivity, edge AI, AI in general, and then cloud computing. Our belief is that we need to provide the best silicon and together with our partners, the best solutions for any place where data needs to be stored, analyzed, transmitted. Because ultimately, We're talking about smart infrastructure, which means there's going to be a need for a lot of data. There's going to be need for analyzing that data, both real time and in batch mode, and ultimately making decisions based on that data. So we are bringing together assets from across the company together with our partners to this future initiative that's currently at a very nascent stage. We are
That's
also
great.
yeah. I was going to say very quickly, I was going to add that I think a resilient supply chain, certainly focused on silicon, but also focused on how an end-to-end supply chain works at the national and the international level, is going to be the other area of fundamental importance. You've heard our CEO sort of being called out in the State of the Union address for the investment we are making in Ohio. We have RISE initiatives, which are all about inclusion and ensuring resilience, including in the supply chain. So those are some areas that I think we need to continue focus on.
Well, that's great. And to pick up on your last point, huge part of inclusion is access to these technologies. I want to touch on the broadband side of things. Could you shed some light for us on the significance of the investment in broadband expansion within IIJA? What role will that play with, not just the future of smart cities, but also the future of, surface transportation and the rest of this package?
Excellent question once again, Bennett. Connectivity is such a fundamental need to make sure that the infrastructure that we're talking about modernizing, we are able to modernize it, but also monitor it real time for its most efficient usage. I'll give you an example, and this sort of branches into the surface transportation question as well. We recently worked with the city of Chicago, with Microsoft and Genetec, to help them instrument real-time capacity management on public transit on their busiest routes. And this was really precipitated because post-COVID, because of the need for social distancing, the capacity became much more reduced. So the city of Chicago came to us for help, and partners in the ecosystem, three of us got together to solve that problem. That's just one example. I think everything from monitoring the health of our bridges, more efficient operation of our airports, and traffic management. The purpose of surface transportation is not to go keep building roads and add lanes, right? We can do that all day long. It's about creating capacity. And if we can create capacity by more efficiently utilizing the roads of today, why invest billions of dollars when a few $1 million can get you the same outcome? So I think that's where the broadband initiative, the access to for people in the inner city areas and rural areas, is going to be a complete game changer, especially when you add on how this will change all the use cases around surface transportation, around airports, marine and shipping and so on.
That's a great point. I think that intersection of accessibility, opening up these new opportunities, but doing it efficiently is so important. And a great parting thought to leave us with as we enter into the panel here. Thank you again, Samir, for being a part of this, and thanks to Intel IoT for the partnership.
Thank you once again.
Now we'll move on to our panel. I'm excited to bring up Issy Lepowski, Protocol Chief Correspondent, and our moderator for today's conversation, to introduce our speakers and get started. Issy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Issy Lepowski. Thank you so much for joining us for this really important discussion. It's a progress report, really, on the infrastructure rollout. And we have a panel discussion coming up in a bit. But first, I am joined today by NTIA Administrator Alan Davidson. Alan, are you with me?
I am with you.
All right.
Good to see you, Izzy. Good to be here.
Fittingly, Alan just got bumped from the broadcast. So, it's a good time to talk about broadband access.
Technology.
Alan, for anyone unfamiliar, Alan is the guy who has sort of the insane task of overseeing the distribution of more than $48 billion in broadband deployment and access grants that were allocated in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So this is the guy to talk about how this is all going to go down. So Alan, I'll dive right in. This is an unprecedented amount of broadband funding. It is a particularly unique position for the NTIA to be in. You've been in the job for about 3 months, and I'm wondering, do you feel a little in over your head yet?
I feel excited. So thank you. First of all, let me just say thank you. Thank you to Protocol for bringing us all together. I know you have an all-star lineup coming up in the panel. Thank you, Izzy, for your your engagement on these issues and coverage of them. And I would just say, it is an exciting time to be working on this here at NTIA. I mean, we have been talking about the digital divide in this country for over 20 years, right? And thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law that we've been talking about, we finally have the resources to seriously close that divide. And so this is an amazing time to be working on this set of issues. I think all of us, the pandemic has just brought home for all of us how critical internet access is to thrive in the modern digital economy. And we've been given this very modest mission by the president and the Congress, which is to make sure that everyone in America has access to high-speed, affordable internet service. And it's an awesome and historic, once-in-a-generation opportunity. So yeah, we're excited here.
Good. Excited, but not daunted, I guess.
It is going to be a lot of work. There's no doubt about it. And the programs that have been put in place some of them are complicated. Some of them are going to really require a lot of coordination within the government. I would say this isn't just an NTIA project. We've really looked and seen, we have colleagues at the Treasury Department, at the FCC, at the USDA. We're all in constant communication now, all working together towards that common goal of making sure that there's high-speed, affordable internet service for everyone.
So let's talk about the BEAD program, which is this more than $42 billion in broadband deployment grants available to states. I know there are a lot of questions out there about exactly what the NTIA is going to ask states to put forward in their proposals. And you gave a recent interview where you talked about the need for flexibility in states' plans. I was wondering if you can give some examples of what kind of flexibility you're talking about exactly, like what is negotiable?
Well, I think it starts with the way that as you say, we've got several different grant programs here within NTIA. The biggest is the state grant program. $42 billion of the $48 billion that we'll be administering are going to be administered through states. The money will be allocated to states based on a formula that's built into the statute about how many unserved locations they have. And we just know that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for every state. The needs of a state like Rhode Island are totally different than the needs of a state like Montana or Alaska or New Mexico. And we expect that states may implement different approaches to how they're going to give out the grants. We expect that states might choose different ways of thinking about the technology mix within their states. That said, there are certain requirements also within the statute that we expect all states will meet, including sort of the statute lays out, definitions for what's an unserved location, what's an underserved location, the need to address the unserved locations first and foremost. And so we expect states will follow that. And there are requirements also for states about consultation with local communities, for example. And that may look a little different in terms of how states do it, but there will be a requirement that all states do that. So there'll be a mix.
Right. And I wanted to talk about the unserved, underserved balance, because, one concern I've heard is that the requirement that states have to certify they've reached 100% of unserved areas before they fund deployment projects in underserved areas. The concern is that could hold up funding for deployments in, say, an underserved urban area in the name of servicing a very expensive, very hard to reach unserved area. Walk me through how you envision those scenarios playing out.
Well, first of all, the statute, just for those who aren't familiar, is very clear about these definitions, right? So an unserved home is defined in the statute as a location that doesn't get at least 25 service that has at least 25 megabits per second downstream, 3 megabits per second upstream. There's also a definition of underserved homes, which are 100 megabits per second downstream, 20 megabits per second upstream. So those things are well defined, and the focus clearly in the statute is on unserved. The statute does offer some flexibility about states, for example, being able to show that they're going to meet the needs. And we expect that there will be some states that will easily meet their need to reaching all of the unserved. Every state, for example, gets a minimum of $100 million. Territories, I think it's a minimum of $25 million. So there'll be some states that won't need that $100 million to reach all of their unserved. We'll know that, and they will be able to quite quickly move to reaching those other communities. And states that can show that will be able to move forward. And I think the statute contemplates that.
Right. So I think people are, looking for some assurance that it's not going to be completely stringent, that there will be some leeway afforded by NTIA for states that find themselves with these unique scenarios. Am I reading you right on that?
Yeah. And I think this, again, it's the statute kind of, contemplates that sort of flexibility for states. And it is clear that unserved first. But again, like I say, the expectation is that there'll be some states that easily meet that. And then there are all these other uses reaching to the unserved, then even other uses beyond that I think many states will find really valuable.
Mm-hmm. A big part of making those calls about what's unserved and what's underserved depends on these FCC maps that still aren't available, as far as I know. How much is that FCC mapping process slowing you down?
Well, the maps are critical, and there's a reason why we need good mapping, which is that without good maps, we don't know where to deploy our funds, right? We don't know where the unserved and underserved locations are. This has been a huge issue historically, where the maps haven't been all that we need them to be. We're fairly confident. We're working very closely with the FCC. We're confident that the new maps are going to be much better. Congress was very clear in the way it spelled this out. The decisions about how funds get allocated and then ultimately how funds get spent on unserved and underserved locations must look to those maps from the FCC. And we're confident that those maps are going to be far better than the maps we've had in the past. The timing is the hard part. The FCC, I know, is hard at work. Chairwoman Rosenworcel has made this a major priority. She's spoken about this. And so we're in close contact with them and working hard to make sure the maps are ready as soon as possible. For us, the starting gun for states really is next month. We will be launching these, releasing our notices of funding opportunity for the set of programs that we're administering. That's both the state grant program as well as our middle mile and digital equity programs. And once we release those notices, that, like I say, is the starting gun for states and for communities to get engaged in those programs. So after that, the states will work on their planning, and then at some time further, when the maps are fully available, that's when we'll expect to see, kind of initial funding plans coming from the states.
Right. How do states do that kind of planning when they don't have the maps to plan with yet?
Well, it's a really important question, and we're doing what we can to provide them with information. We've got our own some great maps that are available and indicators of broadband need at NTIA at our website, and we know states and communities are looking to those. We know that some states have undergone some of their own mapping efforts, and so we know that states aren't flying blind, and and communities, of course, also. Communities have a very good sense, in fact, in some ways are the best indicator. They know where the unserved locations are often in their own communities. And so our hope is that working with local communities, working with the mapping data that's available, states can begin their planning. And then when we have the final maps, we'll be able to make those final determinations about allocations and ultimately where to deploy.
Right. And you expected that, following that logic, the FCC maps would hopefully match up with the maps that communities themselves are looking at early on.
That's the hope, and there will be a challenge process available so that communities can weigh in if they feel that this is all set in the statute around the mapping, that they can weigh in if they have concerns about it. Yeah.
Now, the statute also includes almost $3 billion for these digital equity grants that will promote adoption and digital literacy. But you've also talked about wanting to ensure that the BEAD program itself, this big $42 billion program for broadband deployment, takes into consideration issues of equity. So what does that actually mean in practice?
Well, it's a great question, and I think we're fortunate, first of all, in some ways, to have this combination of programs that let us think about the full range of issues, not just access. And I say that because our goal here is not just access. We can make sure that somebody has an internet connection, but if they can't afford that internet connection, it doesn't do that person or that family a lot of good. If they can afford the connection, but they don't have a device to get online, that doesn't help them. If they can have a device, but they don't actually have applications that are compelling, or they don't have the applications in a language that they speak, then we haven't met our goal. Our ultimate goal is meaningful adoption, having ways for people to engage, to be online, and to thrive in the modern digital economy. To do that in our programs, we're thinking beyond just access, right? Even in the big state grant program, which is mostly focused on infrastructure deployment, there's a giant affordability component to it as well, where we're going to, and the statute requires a low-cost option be made available by those who get federal funding. And so defining that option and making sure it's available to people is a huge component of addressing the affordability pieces of this. We'll also be blending other elements of our digital equity work. States, for example, in their plans are going to be required to include thinking about digital equity, demonstrated ideas about digital equity in their planning processes. So we're, again, trying to use each of these programs to reinforce each other. We have this great digital equity program for $3 billion, but we're braiding these programs together, Middle Mile, which is a real force multiplier for us, the tribal community programs, which are hugely important for reaching that underserved community, and thinking about them all together and addressing these, affordability as well and equity as well as access.
Got it. One other concern I've heard, and again, this is written into the statute, but I'm interested in your thoughts, is that the 100/20 requirement may create its own kind of digital divide in the future, because some states are moving fully toward fiber. And there's this concern that there's going to be what people are calling a speed chasm, not lack of access, but lack of access to speed. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, for a lot of us, 120 sounds pretty fast as a starting point. But the key for those who've been in this, but you're right, the key for us in thinking about this is we want to give everybody broadband that is resilient to the future. 120, if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, 120 would have sounded amazingly fast, right? But today you start to realize that when you think about the applications that people are using, we realize that any speed threshold we put down, in the future may not hold up. So our focus is on making sure that we're extensible and resilient to the future, and that we're giving everyone in America the best broadband that they can have. For a lot of folks, that means that fiber will be the best answer, right? And we expect that states will be looking to fiber as a first starting point. We also know that in some locations, that there may be some places where there are other technologies that need to be in the mix. So it won't be one size fits all. It won't be just one technology, but we are really thinking about the extensibility of this into the future and how to make sure that, the key for us is we don't want to be back here 5 or 10 years from now having this same conversation and saying what happened to all that money. We want to make sure that when we build this is a network and an infrastructure that will last for years for America.
Right. Well, you teed me up perfectly for what was going to be my next question, which was about enforcement. How does the NTIA, ensure that these grants are distributed the way that they're planned and that providers and states are making good on their promises?
Well, we've been given, the statute makes it pretty clear. We've been given, first of all, the authority to approve the initial plans that states put together. States will have to create first they have to create a 5-year plan. They'll have to create an initial plan that lays out how they're going to do their grant making. Only then does the first tranche of money go out, and states will get 20% of their funding, their allocation, after we've approved an initial plan. Then they will have to submit a final plan, and that final plan will have to be approved by NTIA as well, and then the remaining 80% of the funding goes out. So we will have a lot of oversight to make sure that states are following through on the requirements of the statute and are meeting the requirements that are in there. There'll be also a lot, as we've done in other grant programs, of oversight to make sure the money's being spent wisely, to make sure that the sub-grantees who get the money are actually, following through on their commitments. The key in all of this is the states are going to be a major partner of ours in all of this. As you've heard, we've said the word states a lot here in the last 15 minutes. We know that we're going to have to work closely with them and also offer them help. Different states are in really different situations here. Some of them have well-staffed, long-standing broadband offices. Some of them are just starting up their broadband offices. And we know that we're going to have to partner with them and support them. And that's going to be a key part of what we do here in the federal government, giving them the technical assistance and partnership they need to be able to implement these programs.
And you've been meeting with state broadband leaders and accepting comments. And I'm wondering, is there a specific bit of feedback you've gotten from any one of them, or even a number of them, that's been particularly instructive?
I think there's a lot that we've been getting. We're in constant communication. We have a wonderful, something that predates me. That's been here for years. Our state broadband leaders network, and it's a wonderful community of folks who work in broadband offices around the country. We had a meeting here a month ago. 46 of the states were there, and a lot of the 4 of the territories. I think that everybody's very eager is really the only thing. I think the biggest thing we've gotten is a sense of excitement. People, these are a lot of folks, like the folks who will be on your panel next, people who've been working on these issues for years. And the fact that this is now a priority for our country, I think that's the biggest sense of feedback I've gotten, that there's a lot of excitement. And they know they will, some of them need help. Probably the biggest and most important thing that we're building based on the feedback that we've gotten is that we're building a team here at NTIA. There will be a person who each state will know who they can call here, who can answer their questions. And there will be somebody here who gets up every day and thinks about that state and how that state can succeed in our programs. And I think that may be one of the most powerful things we can do, is to build that partnership, and with local communities as well.
Okay, well, before I let you go, you've said next month is the starting gun. Give us a quick timeline of what happens next and when we're going to start to see money flow.
Well, the biggest thing is that state grant program. Again, the notices will be available by May 16th. After that, states will submit their letters of intent to participate in the program. We'll be working with them to do that. Once they do that, we'll be sending out, they each get a $5 million check for planning purposes, which is terrific to have. Actually, it's a very smart thing in the statute to give states actual money for planning, and that'll be an opportunity for people to be engaging with their states. States will then be developing their 5-year plans and ultimately submitting their initial plans to get the 20% of the funding. That allocation of funds and those initial plans will be dependent on those FCC maps, and so that timeline depends, quite a bit on when the FCC maps are in shape to be available for that purpose. In parallel, I should just say we've got a middle mile program that's coming out, and those grants will be starting to accept applications this year for that money. Digital equity planning grants going to states, and our tribal programs, which are ongoing, and you'll be seeing grants coming out to tribal communities, throughout the late spring and into the summer. So stay tuned, watch this space, stay tuned for more. And I would just say, we've been, talking, I said before, talking about the digital divide for over 20 years here, and we've been given this opportunity. It does feel historic in the sense that, generations before us, brought electricity or water to the rural parts of America, built the highway system. This is our generation's moment. This is the project that we have to connect everybody here in this country with the internet, with the digital economy, so that they have an ability to thrive, to learn, to work online. And so we're very excited about being part of that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alan. You have a lot on your plate, so I will let you get back to it. Fingers crossed on those FCC maps. Thanks again.
Great to see you all. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to the panel.
And now I want to bring up our panel. We're going to be talking about broadband, of course, but we're also going to hear a lot more about the parts of the bill of the law that fund electric vehicle investments, which is, of course, hugely important. So if you tuned in for that purpose, now's your time. Joining me today are Angela Seifer, Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Nicole Turner-Lee, Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, and Kelly Fleming, Vice President with Boundary Stone Partners, which is a climate change government affairs firm. Welcome to all of you. So, Angela, I will start with you and continue this conversation that we were having with Alan about equity in the BEAD program. Again, we're calling BEAD program, that's the big broadband deployment, $42 billion in grants. What would you need to see as this money gets rolled out to feel like it is being done equitably?
Thanks for the question, Issy. I love being here. Thank you to Protocol. We need to see that the planning process involves the affordability issue, the device issue, the digital literacy, that they don't think of it as like, well, we're going to get to that after we finish building out everything. Because if folks wait to do that, they're going to be really sad when their adoption numbers are about the same as the urban area nearby, right? Which is not as high as it needs to be either. So the issues that keep people from utilizing internet is not just availability. So we need to make sure that we're seeing that it's wrapped into the plan. All of these different barriers are wrapped into the plan. So I was listening when Alan said that the digital equity was going to be required in the plan. And I think he meant the BEAD plan. Mm-hmm. So I'm super curious to see how they require that and exactly how folks respond to that. We think a really important first step for the states is to make sure that it's somebody's job in that state government to be looking at digital equity and addressing digital equity and planning for it, and not just to say, we'll just hire a consultant and they'll figure that out for us.
What would you like to see NTIA look for in those plans? As you said, they're going to be requiring this as part of the BEAD program. Like what should they be looking for?
Yeah, so we want to know that they're looking at all the barriers at the same time, and that those covered populations, that their broadband access is being addressed not just in terms of availability, but that they're also looking at the other barriers that would keep those covered populations from participating.
Nicole, you're also an expert in this world. You testified before Congress recently about the importance of ensuring that the funding is distributed equitably across rural and urban areas. And there are obvious challenges to that, given the way, as we talked with Alan about, given the way the statute is written with the unserved areas being served first. How do you think NTIA and states can square those two issues?
Well, thank you, Issy, for having me, and it's good to be on the panel with my fellow colleagues. I mean, listen, the problem we're going to have, and I think Alan sort of indicated this, is that there's so many moving parts to this legislation. So the first and foremost is I think we have to really parse out what these parts are and then put the jigsaw puzzle back together so that we're not having either competing interests or we're not overbuilding in some areas and creating the lack of resources for adoption. I think we have to put that out there. This is going to be a challenge of making sure that this is a coherent plan. With that being said, I think we would be silly just to not think about the ways in which we have to fill pockets within urban areas. And I'll tell you why. I mean, when we think about the number of young people that were sent home from school, a lot of those young people were actually in urban communities that were not able to get access to the internet. There are some caveats in the legislation that are going to point to other community anchor institutions that should be funded. But as Angela said, it's sort of a trail. It goes in an order. As one group gets it, then the next group, and then if there's money left, then we'll give it to the community anchor institutions. Well, that's not going to work if we find out that when we're trying to build out communities in the most unserved areas, that we've actually spent all the money that we can't get to the underserved. So I think it's really important for us to be real clear about that. We're not talking about prioritizing this legislation rural over urban. We shouldn't. I don't think that was the intent of the scope of work that we're trying to engage in right now. What we're trying to do is create the word universal access, and that means just paying attention to the nuances that exist between each type of community and ensuring that we're not leaving people behind students, workers, people who need to take advantage of telehealth and remote healthcare services. That's the intention of this, which is why I think, you've heard me talk about it, Issy. Closing the digital divide is not about bits and bytes, as it was said by Intel. It's really about improving upon the human capital of participation in the digital economy.
And is that a fixable issue in the statute for you, or is it kind of baked in? I mean, it is written how it's written. How do you navigate that?
I don't know. I mean, I was hoping my book would be out before the statute was written, so then that way there'd be some gospel on how to close the digital divide. Listen, I think that there's going to be some flexibilities that exist, and I think, as Angela said, the key component of this will be the states. The extent to which states actually engage in comprehensive mapping, the extent to which they have inclusive roundtables of community actors and stakeholders, the extent to which they understand, because we won't have the maps ready, as Alan said, before we actually go out and invest the money, what broadband looks like within their states, regions, communities. I think they're going to be the prime actor to make this work. And I think given, some of the expertise of states that are either more advanced in mapping, like the state of Minnesota, or other states that have been very active with regards to doing this collaborative thinking before the money was allocated, or years before this became allocated money, I think they're going to be the ones where we're going to actually have to go back to and see if those equity plans that they've actually developed really are going to work.
All right, Kelly, it's time to bring you in. We've got a lot of broadband experts here, but you are our resident transportation expert. And we should not forget that this law includes about $30 billion for electric vehicles and infrastructure, including charging stations, electric school buses, and more. It also includes a lot of money for roads and bridges, which I've seen some analysis that says, that could lead to increased emissions if we're investing a whole lot more in surface transportation. So how do we prevent those surface transportation investments from offsetting the positive climate effects of investing in EVs in this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're kind of separate pots, but what you're referring to is induced demand, which is the idea that as we build more roads and increase lane miles, more people will drive. So we have to balance that with first repairing the roads that we already have, using the money to make sure that, we've made sure our bridges are safe. We have public transit infrastructure. We're repairing the roads that are crumbling. And then also using some of the clean energy money and EV charging money to promote electric transit, electric ride share, and promoting kind of the more communal shared ride platform rather than everyone needs their own car, especially in urban areas. Of course, we have to balance that with the different needs of rural communities and urban communities and making sure that that's equitable as we do it.
Staying with you, we've talked a lot, you just said the word, we've talked a lot about equity in the context of broadband. But it's also important in the context of electric vehicle infrastructure. So what steps do the states and the Department of Transportation need to take to ensure that funding is spent in a way that promotes that equitable distribution of charging stations and other infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels with what Nicole just said for broadband. And the administration has issued the executive order called Justice 40. So that's a really great start. That requires them to invest at least 40% of federal infrastructure money in disadvantaged communities. And the way that that's determined is a tool that the Council on Environmental Quality made that balances public health outcomes, income levels, and zip codes, and things like that. I think it's also really important, as Nicole brought up, to bring those communities into the planning process at the state and local level and ensuring that they're having their needs met rather than us just telling them, this is the best way to get EVs into these communities. There's also kind of a chicken and egg problem here where this bill passed a lot of infrastructure money without passing money that will incentivize getting the actual vehicles into these communities. So I will state that there is some importance of passing Build Back Better or some sort of bill like Build Back Better that will create those incentives to get the vehicles into the communities, especially for used vehicles and fleet vehicles, which is where I'm going to plug the importance of having more infrastructure for rideshare vehicles. Not only will it help kind of expose communities to like the benefits of electric vehicles through riding in them. But a lot of the drivers in those programs live in the same communities that should be targeted with these infrastructure investments. So making sure that we're providing incentives for the drivers to get the vehicles as well as the charging stations will kind of help solve some of the chicken and egg problem and hopefully expose more people in those communities to the benefits of EVs.
And who should be, excuse the pun, driving that initiative? Is it the rideshare companies? Is it local governments where they operate, or is it the federal government?
We're going to need a lot of public-private partnerships. So we need, it depends on the model. So one of the Boundary Stone clients is called Revel Rideshare, and they actually install public charging hubs for their rideshare drivers who are in the employee model, as opposed to what you consider in the gig economy with the rideshare companies we're more familiar with. So they provide the vehicle and the charging hub. The charging hub is also open to the public. So they tend to be in the target areas for disadvantaged communities, according to the Justice 40 formula. So that provides kind of a solution to the chicken and egg problem. And they've been able to, they do this in New York City right now, but they're looking to expand. And through working with the local government and the state, they've been able to kind of site and plan these stations to try to get the most benefit out of them. And we're hoping to see other companies do similar projects, as well as other cities kind of look at this as a good solution to the problem.
That's great. And Nicole, I know I said Kelly was our resident climate expert, but you have also, I've seen, connect the dots between broadband expansion and climate tech. Where do you see those two investments overlapping?
Oh, I think it's such a great connection, Issy, and I'm glad that you're bringing it up, right? Because one of the things that broadband infrastructure will do, it was allow communities, particularly Black and brown communities, be healthier, right? The levels of pollution, the associated chronic disease. Look at what happened with COVID, where the quality of housing had something to do with that. We should be looking at all aspects of infrastructure as part of this bill. And I think the transportation infrastructure is going to be just as important as broadband infrastructure, because if you live in a community where you do not have broadband, you cannot have the extent to which some of the technologies we're seeing in the electric vehicle space. So I think that is really important. Particularly the other area that I think broadband is important, and I love the way Kelly talked about it. I did not think about this. In my research, I have found, Kelly, that if you live in very poor rural communities, you basically do not own a car. So as a result of that, there's not a lot of ride sharing services and applications. So I like the way you're framing it, having the ability to sort of correlate transportation assets, broadband assets. Let's just go further, Issy, right? Water, electrical, and the whole nine will actually allow us to have thriving communities where broadband is a complement and it gives people options and ways to participate in the digital economy. So I think we haven't made that connection yet. A couple of hearings that I've been on have tried to, but I think that this conversation is really important because at the end of the day, again, it's like that jigsaw puzzle in broadband. We need to bring all these pieces together.
Mm-hmm. And Nicole, you've also been a real advocate for tech neutral broadband deployment. And as I discussed earlier with Alan, there are a lot of people out there who are, fiber or bust, and not just people who work in that industry. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these concerns about the speed chasm that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I love that conversation because it's so funny. As I've done some recent research at Brookings, clearly we've gotten to a great space where we actually have some minimum requirements when it comes to broadband speeds. And I think this idea of having standards comported into communities as we look at the infrastructure bill are going to be interesting as well. The challenge is how long is it going to take, right? And how much money is it going to take? And I am of the opinion, and some people who actually are just fiber only folks, please forgive me. I'm trying. We have to also realize that this is a finite amount of money. And the extent to which we actually put all the money and build the type of fiber structure that we should have done a long time ago, much like we've done with telephone as well as electricity, it may actually max out what we're looking at in terms of this fund. So I'm actually a big fan of where we can actually one, go to fiber first, but then also think about hybrid models, particularly going back to your conversation about the unserved and the underserved. What happens in urban communities, again, where there's maybe a lack of competition or there's a lack of competitive options when it comes to fast service? So what do we do there, right? Where there might be some fiber runs, but we may need to actually invest more in wireless infrastructure or 5G for that matter. I mean, New York City is looking at models like that. I think we just have to make sure as we're going through this that we consider this to also be an iterative process. I know that Congress has pretty much, solid determinants of how they want legislation to go. But one thing that we have learned in this space, and I know Angela's been in this space as long as I have, that technology changes rather quickly than policy. So I think the more that we can have a flexible standpoint around, those speed areas, as well as the type of technology that we're relying on, because the statute says technology neutrality, but we have to be careful that we don't expend it in one space.
Mm-hmm. Angela, Alan was talking about the importance of states to consult with their local communities, and your organization is deeply, deeply involved in local communities. I wonder, where do you expect to see points of friction between state plans and what local governments want?
I think Nicole's already highlighted some of those friction points, which is that urban areas may want to fill some of these affordability gaps or other digital equity gaps. And then folks at the state may say, no, we're only building infrastructure in rural areas. So we are encouraging states to look at the whole population, all the covered populations in the whole state and how they can help everybody. But also it's the stakeholder engagement. So we are, and NDIA is encouraging that the local folks be talking to the state folks be talking to the local folks, and that there are quite a few communities actually working on their own digital equity plans, working on implementation plans. And the more that local communities are doing that, then the state can utilize all of their learnings when they're building both their BEAD and their digital equity plans. I think there's a mindset of, well, it's going through the states, so let's only talk about the states. And I think that's a huge miss, that the local folks are already doing amazing work. One, we need to learn from them. Two, utilize what they're learning, right? That if we don't have the state understanding what's happening at the local level and utilize all those learnings and encourage it even, then we're not going to see the plans that we would want to see. And I think that's also how we get at the fact that there's more than one barrier and we need holistic solutions. Even if the solution is, okay, well, we're just going to cover affordability. If you're not also addressing the other barriers, again, you're going to be sad with the results because you narrowed your focus only on one barrier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked about ensuring that the digital equity is part of the BEAD program, but it occurs to me that the actual digital equity grants, the nearly $3 billion for digital equity grants, that money will probably be available a lot sooner than these broadband projects are completed. Is that its own chicken and egg problem? Because here you're going to have money for digital literacy and adoption, but you might not have the connectivity. How do you deal with that?
I do think that's a challenge, but at the same time, folks are already figuring out workarounds now. So let's help them with that, right? So the folks who are having to go to the library for their connectivity, they have other needs while that infrastructure is being built. The computer they're using isn't the right computer, isn't the right device, right? Maybe they're relying upon a mobile phone, but they actually need a computer. They always have to use the ones at the library, right? There's other barriers, the digital literacy piece, the tech support. So we can build those systems. And I think that's the other big thing about this is that it would be an incredible shame if that $2.75 billion only just went out and then it was gone, but didn't actually change our systems and how we think about this work, because we need to make sure, as Nicole said, these divides are not going away. The next time somebody tells you they're going to solve the digital divide, look at them with a little squinty eye, because they are maybe missing a couple points, like the fact that technology is going to keep changing. So we may solve some aspects of the digital divide, but we will never solve digital divides overall because the technology keeps changing. So we have to have systems in place whereby we see the next technology coming and we figure out how we're going to address it before it's actually here. 5G, fiber, where are they going? Are they going to wealthier neighborhoods, poorer neighborhoods, right? We need to make sure we're addressing that. As the technology changes, the apps change, how we use the apps change. Where's the tech support? Right. So if some of us have particular people in our lives, or we can go to a Genius bar, but for other folks, that is outside the realm of possibility. So we don't have those systems right now. So what I'm very hopeful about is that this money changes how some of our community-based organizations work, and that some of our local philanthropy and our local governments and our state governments see the value to the community of having these programs, because we have to figure out how to keep funding them when this money is gone.
Right. And Issy, can I jump into on that as real quick too? I mean, I think what Angela is saying is so true, right? And both of us have had the opportunity to be in, boots on the ground in many communities over the course of our careers. I mean, the challenge that we're going to have is if too much money goes out into, pilot projects that are advancing digital literacy, we're still going to have the challenge of not enough money going into those communities to build what should be considered an ecosystem around tech. Going back to what Kelly said, the ability to create new jobs, the ability to have ride sharing services, the ability to have, a streamlined electrical grid. There are larger community and economic development benefits that come with having broadband. And I think our focus in the digital equity side should really be challenged. We should be, as Americans, thinking about how other countries have actually handled this and think of this as like we are starting to now, 30 years after Larry Irving talked about the digital divide, as a policy imperative. Because if we go too quick on one end, we're going to have, as you keep saying, the chicken and the egg. You're going to have either a lot of broadband and not a lot of consumers, or a lot of consumers and not a lot of broadband. And I think what we've learned in the pandemic is that you need both. You need an even distribution, because at the end of the day, this is not about the digital divide. This is about the asymmetry that comes with wealth and power and civic engagement and the ability to actually benefit from a digital economy. And that, I think, is a little shift that we should be making as we talk about where we go with this money.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good place to bring up the enrollment issues that the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program had early on. There were, the infrastructure bill makes that benefit from broadband bills permanent, essentially. But by the end of last year, the numbers I saw, there were about 9 million people enrolled in that Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, and some estimates suggested that was about a quarter of the households that actually qualified. So Angela, you and I talked a lot about the EBB program when it first launched. What needs to be done as EBB transitions to this permanent program to ensure that everyone who could benefit from it actually gets enrolled?
The biggest thing we need is outreach. We just think folks are just going to find out about it, right, through some magical right? And if they do hear free internet, it sounds like a scam. We think we learned that lesson again and again at the height of the pandemic, when lots of folks were trying to solve the affordability issues. So they were paying for community members' internet, and community members were saying no, and they just walk away because free internet sounds like a scam. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand what are the other reasons that folks would not take free internet? How do we make sure that information gets to them? So what's the trusted source of where that information is coming from? And then making sure that we're addressing all the other barriers. Because as we've mentioned a couple of times now, it's not just about the internet service itself. There may be device issues, there may be privacy and security concerns, there may be other digital skills needs that person has. And so we have to address all of their needs, because if we think we're only going to fix it by addressing one, we're not going to get to the results that we want to get to. So I think that's a big piece of it. We're hearing a lot about the device necessity, that in places where there's a device, even just a phone, folks are like, yeah, that's the one I want. Does the service meet their needs? Maybe not, but they got a phone. So that's a problem, right? Not enough of the internet service providers are participating in the device side of it. It's only $100 for the device. So that's a big issue. We have to figure out how to solve that device issue. We haven't. IIJA does not solve that. There's Digital Equity Act could be used for devices, but if we use it all for devices, there's nothing left for digital literacy.
Right.
So this is one of those reminders of, yes, we're going to make great progress with IIJA, but we are not going to solve the digital divide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kelly, I want to welcome your dog to the panel. I also want to close it out with you. A lot of what's in this bill, and I think you touched on this with the mention of ride sharing, but a lot of that, still depends on people actually driving or getting from place to place in a car. What needs to happen to get the local and inner city rail system in the US up to speed with, say, Europe or Japan?
Well, that's a good question. There are a lot of reasons that we're so far behind when it comes to passenger rail, and a lot of it is cost. And there are a lot of reasons that it costs more in the United States. I think if you've heard the phrase NIMBY, not in my backyard, a lot of the people who don't really want rail because they're worried about property value will use some of the environmental regulations to kind of slow down and increase the cost of installing rail. Yeah, so I think it's going to take a while to reform the laws that we need to reform, unfortunately, both at the state and federal level. But I'm hoping there will be more focus on that in the future, because it seems pretty obvious that people want more options to travel than driving their own car. Like, people from LA want to be able to get to San Francisco without getting stuck in traffic, and they can work on the train. People want to be able to get from DC to New York on. They can take the Amtrak right now, but it still takes 3 hours. They want to be able to get from Philadelphia to, I don't know, North Carolina on a train. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to catch up soon, but it's going to take some political will, I think.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. This has been a really fascinating conversation about a really important topic. And I want to thank everybody who joined us at home for watching. And we hope to see you next time at our next Protocol Live event. Thanks so much.
Thank you.